Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's Connect with Control-M. I'm Neil Blanford, a technical support analyst. I support Control-M in the US from the Houston office. Joining us today are Brian Looney and Ted Levitt. Today, we'll be discussing installing Control-M Enterprise Manager on a Windows cluster. So if you need to do this, then this will be for you. So let's begin by looking at our agenda. We'll start with a brief discussion about Windows clustering. Next, we'll take a look at installation considerations. There'll be a demonstration of a cluster install. We'll validate the installation. And finally, there'll be a question and answer session. So to be successful running Control-M on a Windows cluster, there are some basics that need to be understood. A Windows cluster is an active-passive environment. This means that the clustered application will only run on one node at a time. The cluster integrates with Active Directory and network services to provide a single access point. This means you don't need to update DNS or other services when the application node changes. To install Control-M9, the cluster will need a disk, a client access point, and suitable nodes to run on. When the installer is run, it will note that it's being run on a cluster node and provide the cluster install option. The cluster resources have to be available and correctly configured, as we will shortly see. There are a few installation considerations for Control-M9. Now, mostly these are the same as for a standalone Enterprise Manager installation, and the prerequisites in the installation guide do still apply. We recommend using the sizing template. Control-M9 does have different hardware requirements from previous versions. The user that installed Enterprise Manager does have to have administrative privilege on the systems. If you're intending to use MS SQL as a database, then you should have the required credentials prior to starting the installation. We recommend using the SA account, as this will create an additional database login with the correct roles predefined. So before we start our demonstration, let's just talk about our demo environment here. Usually, you'll have a separate client machine installed. We've simulated this by installing a standalone client outside of the cluster. We have a two-node cluster that uses shared iSCSI storage, and we've configured a client access point. The cluster and the roles have been predefined, so we won't be defining these at this point. So now I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll take a look at our cluster here. So this is the machine we'll be installing on. As you can see, this is the Failover Cluster Manager, and we have our cluster defined. Let's take a look. Looking at the nodes, you can see we have our two nodes, 1 and 2. Both of these are up. Let's take a look at the storage. We have two disks. Disk 1 is a quorum disk. Disk 2 is a disk we'll be doing the installation on. As you can see, both of these are online, and note the role name there has been assigned. Take a quick look at the network as well. This is our client access point, and we can see our IP address there. Finally, let's check the role. You can see this is the role. Now, this is just a fairly basic role. You can see the role name here, CL2-EM. This you'll see in various places as we go along, so take a note of that. You'll see the status is running. The type is other, and you can see this machine we're on is the owner node. This is very important for the installation. Otherwise, we won't be able to install Enterprise Manager at this point. So let's verify our roles correctly configured here. Let's expand our access point, check our access point is online, and look at the IP addresses. Let's take a look at our disk resource. That's our cluster disk. So that looks good for installation. Now, notice this application here. This is an application that I've created. As we'll see in a second, what I'm going to do is fail this, and I'll show you why you have to have everything online for the installation to succeed. The installation is cluster aware, so it will know if your cluster doesn't meet the requirements. So what we're going to do now is simulate a failure on this, and we'll notice that our role has gone to a failed state. So let's move ahead with the installation. Here's our DVD that we've got mounted on this machine. This is the root of it. As we can see, we've got setup.exe here. We're actually going to install the EM component by drilling down into setup files, components, and then the EM folder. We'll run this setup.exe. As with all our installations, right-click, select Run as Administrator. And it'll load. Now, one thing you'll notice if you've done Control M9 installation before is that the bulk of this process is the same as actually doing a standalone installation. And we're actually running the same setup.exe here. So at this point, we're going to accept this and click Next. This is the first difference. You'll notice that we have the cluster group or local install options. So the installer's picked up that we're on a cluster node. And we're going to stick with the default of cluster group here. Click Next. At this point, ordinarily, we all here and any resources in these drop-down boxes. However, because we failed that application, our role is not valid for installation at this point. We see the role name, CL2-EM here, and marked as unavailable. So at this point, what we need to do is go back and resolve our environmental issues before we can install. And this is quite a common situation. So let's go and bring this guy back online. We see our status is back to running. So it looks like we're good. Now what we can do with the installer here is go to Previous. We don't need to rerun it. And we can click Next again. Now everything shows up as it should. We've got our role name up here. And we've got our disk and network resource here. So if we had multiple disks or multiple network resources, we'd be able to pick one from the drop-down box. So we'll click Next. At this point, it's going to go forward and it'll give us a choice of location. Notice here the installation path is E program files. E is our shared drive. We're going to go with the default installation in this case. If we were installing using MS SQL, we'd select Custom Installation and go through and fill in the fields as a standalone installation. There's no differences there. We'll click Next. So we're going to leave the default database size here, and I'll enter the passwords. Once again, we click Next. Here we are right before we hit Install. So there are a couple of things to notice. You won't see any host names. That's the main thing. Here, you'll see the naming service host name, C2EM, and we'll see the database server is also C2EM. This is a Postgres installation, obviously, on the local machine. So that's really the difference between doing a cluster install versus standalone. So at this point, ordinarily, to install it, we'll hit Install, and it'll install as normal. What we'll do now is just take a look at the location of the install logs. There's an environmental variable called %temp%. So if we navigate to that, we can see that it resolves to this location, which is in my user profile, temp directory. This is where the install logs are. So you can see in here we have plenty of EM install logs. We have the output from some various checks, C-script version, .NET framework check, and we have a summary of the installation parameters. One thing to notice with this, because this is a terminal session, a remote desktop session, the temp location is actually a subfolder, in this case named 2. If this wasn't a terminal session, we were doing this on the machine, all this would be up one level in that temp directory. So that's our installation. Let's move on. Rather than wait for that to install, let's move on to a pre-installed Enterprise Manager here. So back in the Failover Cluster Manager, what we can see is we have our cluster and our role defined here, we can see this has a slightly different name, but it's running, and the owner node is actually the other machine in this cluster rather than the one we're on. Now, looking down at the resources, the difference we see here is that we have our cluster services up and running. So you can see at the top, our Postgres service, configuration manager server, our configuration agent, global conditions server, GSR or GUI server, naming service, and the web server. Let's take a look at what this looks like in the services panel. So here we see two services, the Postgres service and the configuration agent. Notice that both of these are configured to run as local system and set for manual startup type. This is running on the other node at this point, so neither of these are running. Now, you may notice that there's only two here. So going back to our failover cluster manager, this is because only those two are actually Windows services. The others all are either applications or scripts. So if we take a look at, for example, the naming service here, and look at the properties, we see this is a type of generic script. We look at our configuration server, and we look at the properties here, we can see this is a generic application. So let's take a look at the configuration manager at this point and see what that looks like. So as you can see here, there's our enterprise manager, CL1-EM. First thing to notice, running on field. We don't see any host names once again. This is all the virtual name. We see a desired state is a mixture of up and ignored. Even though these are all set to up, these EM components are actually managed by the cluster. The cluster will restart them. So what you see here is normal and seems contradictory, but that's okay. The cluster does look after these. So at this point, what I'm going to do is we're going to run what we have a simple OS job that we've got predefined. I'm going to order that in and run it. We're going to take a look at it, and then we're going to move our application to a second node. And then we're going to rerun the job and take a look just to validate our installation, make sure everything fails over properly. So during this process, what we'll see is on the failover cluster manager is the services, cluster services all come offline temporarily and come back up. And we'll also see our enterprise manager GUI components disconnect. So there'll be maybe some error messages and some disconnections going on while that happens. And then as things come back up, we either reconnect automatically or we may have to log back in. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll order this job here. This is just a simple OS job that does an LS. So that's ordered. Let's move to the monitoring domain, make sure everything ran fine here. Just a quick note on this, only our EM in this case is clustered. Our Control M server is actually a standalone server on a completely different machine. So looking at the job log, we can see our job ran, ended successfully, and there's the output. All fairly normal stuff. So let's go back to our failover cluster manager. We can see everything's online at this point. So let's right-click on our role, select Move, select Node, and that's our other node. So this is a node. We're moving it to the node we're actually on. So what we'll see here is the owner node change, and all these come offline. So as you can see, all the resources, the network resources, go on offline, back online. As they come back online, the cluster services come back online. And we can see our owner node has changed to host 1. So that was all fairly quick. If we go back to our services, and we refresh it, we should see now that machine. So let's minimize that. Everything looks good at this point so far. Let's go back to our configuration manager here. And first thing we notice here is that, this hasn't actually reconnected quite yet. We're still waiting for this to reconnect. You can tell this by the fact that all these buttons are grayed out. In a minute or two, this will come back, and there it is. These have become active again, so it's reconnected. So we can refresh this, and we see that the desired states and the states are all back as they were. Let's go back to our GUI client. We can see this has reconnected itself. So let's expand that. We're back in the monitoring domain. We'll select our job again. We'll right-click it. Now, we know the Control-M server is available. We've got the rerun option here. So it looks like everything is back up and running. So let's go ahead and rerun this job. So we do want to rerun it. And that failed. So things may not quite be back online yet. Let's just give it a second here. Let's make sure our gateway is connected. Let's look at our Control-M server. Seems to say it's up. Perhaps I was just a bit too eager there. So the rerun has become grayed out. I think at this point we're still waiting for the GUI client to reconnect. Now, while we're doing that, it's worth mentioning also that we've simulated a separate client installation here by doing a local install on one of these machines. One thing we don't recommend is that you actually run the client from one of the cluster installations. So that would be the client that's installed, say, on the E drive. What happens when you fail over then is that the client is using files that are within that. And if you fail over from the machine, in the first instance, it's going to slow the failover down because it has to wait for the client to release those before it can remove the storage. In the second instance, the client's basically going to have all its files pulled away from under it, and it'll crash. So definitely, in a clustered environment, use a separate install of the client application. So we have a general Q&A KA, KA 433027. It's a fairly new KA, so there's only a few question and answer on there, but actually it's something we're building up, so as more come in, we're going to add to it. So this is a great KA to bookmark and keep an eye on it. As we get quick, frequently asked questions, we'll add them to that. Also, there's a short URL to the cluster installation section on the install guide. So that's a fantastic resource. We always recommend that you thoroughly read the installation guide before starting the install. That way, you understand the process and you will have fewer problems. Well, thank you for taking the time out of your day to attend. I hope this information was useful and you'll be receiving a survey as you close the webinar. We encourage you to fill it out and provide feedback on future topics and where we can improve. And you can always follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our past webinars can be viewed on BMC Communities, YouTube, and iTunes. We'll be posting this webinar in a few days. Our next webinar will be on the Amigo process.